Good evening. I'm Leonard Baines, the Dean of the University of Houston Law Center, and I'd like you to welcome you to the Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series. The University of Houston Law Center is a top-tier law school with several nationally ranked programs in intellectual property, health law, part-time program tax, environmental law, and energy law. And we take diversity very, very seriously. 50% of our entering class are women, and 36% are members of underrepresented groups. They are excellent with a median GPA of 3.6 and a median LSAT of 160. Many are first-generation college students, first-generation Americans, first-generation law school students. And we have an award-winning pipeline program for low-income, first-generation, and students who are from underrepresented backgrounds, which through their efforts have increased LSAT scores of those students 10 to 14 points. And we've been recognized by Diversity Magazine 5 times in a row with the Higher Education Excellence and Diversity Award. And since George Floyd's death, the faculty passed a resolution to work to eradicate discrimination and to be anti-racist. And we've hosted a number of talks and lectures on racial and social justice issues. A lot of the talks have focused on African Americans, some on Latinos, and we also want to make sure we cover all underrepresented groups, and that's based on tonight's speaker, where we have the very esteemed Frank Wu, who's president of Queens College. So I'd like to introduce Frank. But first, before I introduce Frank, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors. We have with us tonight the head of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I want to introduce them, who've been responsible for a lot of our anti-racist, anti-discrimination efforts over the past few months. Many thanks to Meredith Duncan and Jeff Hoffman. Meredith Duncan is our Assistant Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Metropolitan Programs, and she's co-chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And Professor Jeff Hoffman is the clinical professor in immigration law, and he is co-chair of our Diversity Committee as well. Let's give them a round of applause for all their work over the past few months. They've done an outstanding job. Thank you, Jeff and Meredith. I'd also like to thank our other co-sponsors, the Asian American Law School Student Association of UH, the Asian American Bar Association of Houston, the Houston Bar Association, and the Houston Young Lawyers Association. So many thanks for them for also co-sponsoring this event. And lastly, this event has CLE credit. You probably saw flash before your eyes a way for you to actually gain CLE credit. That will again be posted after Frank's talk and after the Q&A question and answer. But now let me introduce my friend Frank Wu. So Frank Wu is really the perfect person for this conversation. He is really a leading thought leader on the areas of race and ethnicity, and specifically Asian Americans, but sort of more generally on a lot of different things. He's currently the president of Queens College, which is part of City University of New York. He started in that role earlier this summer. I read that he's the second Asian American to hold the position of president of a CUNY college, but he's the first of Queens College. And in fact, ironically, the other president at Baruch is also named, well, Dr. Wu. In announcing his appointment, CUNY Chancellor Felix Matos Rodriguez described President Wu as a trailblazer in legal education who has broken barriers for Asian Americans. So prior to Queens College, Frank had previously served as Chancellor and Dean of UC Hastings School of Law, and has been, at that time, was the first Asian American to serve in that capacity. And you'll see a pattern here. And prior to Hastings, Frank served as Dean of Wayne State Law School, where he was also the first Asian American to serve in that capacity. Also at Wayne State, he was the youngest law school dean at the time in the nation at 36 years old. And at that time, he was one of only 3 Asian American law school deans in the country. Prior to serving as president and dean of all those institutions, Frank was also the first Asian American professor to teach and be tenured at Howard Law School, historically Black law school located in Washington, D.C. So you see a pattern here. Frank has put himself out in a lot of different positions where he has been the first in a multitude of contexts. But he's also very well known as a scholar and a very influential dean. In 2013, the National Jurist ranked Frank as the most influential dean in legal education in the country, and the third in the nation among legal educators and advocates influencing the ongoing debate about legal education. He's also a recipient of Diverse Issues in Higher Education's John Hope Franklin Award. And what Frank probably is best known for is he's a compelling essayist and author. He's the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. The book became a part of the canon in Asian American studies and is widely used on the subject. He received a $95,000 grant issued by the Federal Civil Liberties and Public Education Fund to co-author Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese Internment. And you may have seen him, he's a frequent commentator in newspapers and online journals, including Diverse Issues in Higher Ed, the Daily Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. He's also appeared on Oprah and The O'Reilly Factor, and he's debated Dinesh D'Souza and Ward Connolly about affirmative action. And he's a lawyer, obviously. Prior to his academic career, he was a law clerk to the late U.S. District Court Judge Frank Batista in Cleveland, Ohio. And he was a lawyer associate at the very prominent San Francisco firm of MoFo, Morrison and Foster. So I want to thank Frank for being here. Let's welcome him. The title of his talk is Asian Americans at a Crossroads During COVID-19 Allyship and the Future of Rights, Civil Rights. Let's welcome Frank Wu.
Thank you. Thank you so much to my good, dear old friend, Dean Baines, who I've known since we just got started as law professors. It's great to be joining you virtually. I'm fond of visiting Houston, Texas, which has an historic Asian American population as one of the fastest growing, largest, and most diverse communities in this democracy of ours. So I'm going to show a few PowerPoints and talk in a way that I hope is different than anything you've heard before. I want to provoke you to think for yourselves using a different lens, not to persuade you to think as I do. And then we'll engage in dialogue, because that's at the heart of our diverse democracy. Let me frame this conversation, though. We know this is an historic moment. We're always living through history, of course, but we rarely catch ourselves self-conscious, self-aware, and say this moment is different. This moment is important. Yet, whoever you are, whatever your background, whatever your walk of life, we know that our lives now have the period before 2020, the pandemic that we're only now emerging from, although in so many parts of the nation and around the world we continue to suffer. And we will have what lies ahead. We know that our children and grandchildren will ask us what it was like. So as a people, all of us, we stand at this crossroads as we address not only the pandemic, but the murder of Mr. George Floyd confirmed what so many knew to be obvious, but others would wish to deny or dismiss, that as much as we've made progress on the ideals that we share, nonetheless, there are problems of racial discrimination, racial disparities, and violence that results in death, captured by citizen journalists in a way that we want to avert our gaze, yet are compelled to witness what has happened, that it isn't an accident. These are deliberate acts, not just one, not just two, but dozens, and names that we might not even know, though we should. So this is a moment that is fraught. It is a moment of tension. It is a moment of anxiety. And yet I have hope in the power of words and rhetoric, of principles, of coalition building. Dean Baines mentioned that I had the honor, I was humbled to serve as a professor at Howard University. I was the first Asian American to teach law there at the leading historically Black institution of higher education in this nation. And I learned as much as I taught. I realized that I had prejudices without even being aware of it, and despite myself, that I enjoyed privileges that I hardly noticed as I walked down the street, where kids might come up to me and say ching chong something and challenge me to a karate match. But I was not, as my colleagues and friends who were Black were stereotyped as a thug, a mugger, a felon, someone dangerous, someone that you would want to avoid and cross the other side of the street to avoid coming into contact with. So that's what got me thinking about these issues. The truth is, when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s in the American Midwest, Detroit, the Motor City, is my hometown, I never would have wanted to address any of this, the changing face of our nation. I just wanted to be normal, to fit in, to be like any other kid, to ride my bicycle around the block and just be cool and hang out. Yet I always knew that we were different before diversity was celebrated, before multiculturalism was a term. To be different was wrong. I knew that my friends' parents wouldn't be my parents' friends. We were the only Orientals on the block, that term still in use then, connoting an exoticism, as if we belonged halfway around the world. Yet, because I understood what it was like to be different from that experience, even though I was told, lighten up, just get over it, just reply, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, which even as a kid I wondered about, because the words led to the sticks and stones, because the words are powerful in their own right. I realized that it wasn't enough just to care about the issues that affected me, that we all know only our own suffering, and sometimes we don't even know that. Yet to be able to acknowledge that and to have an opportunity to remedy it requires and compels empathy, to be able to comprehend the suffering of those who are not like us, at least not superficially, those who would doubt that they had common cause, just as we would doubt that we had common cause with them. So it's with those thoughts as a way of framing the conversation that I'll share with you a little bit of background on the Asian American experience and how it can and should, must lead to allyship with Black Lives Matter and with the historic struggle for Black equality. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Give me one moment here. And you should now be looking at a PowerPoint that says Asian Americans at a Crossroads. So I believe you can move my image and all the other images that you're looking at so you can see more or less of the PowerPoint. And if you want my head to be a big giant head, I think you can actually do that as well by dividing the screen. So let me talk about this and then we'll engage in dialogue. So we have had for a long time a black and white paradigm. What I mean by that is we've assumed that everyone belongs in just one of two boxes, that they're mutually exclusive and opposed, and that this is a story of villains and victims, those who are open and unashamed in their hatred, and those who are faceless, who have this violence inflicted upon their bodies and upon whole communities. In 1968, the Kerner Commission, investigating the long, hot summers when places such as Detroit or Newark and elsewhere burned in the north as well as the south and the west too, they referred to America in their conclusion as two nations, black and white, separate, hostile, and unequal. Sociologists, some time later, more than a generation later, more than 20 years later, wrote a New York Times bestseller that borrowed that as the title, Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal. That book by Andrew Hacker was and remains a canonical work that details the differences, the material differences in people's life prospects, from infant mortality to housing segregation to life expectancy on the basis of race, in virtually every instance, on average, to the advantage of whites and the disfavor of blacks. There's no denying this. Yet when I wanted to write a term paper about Asian Americans and civil rights, and I went to the library when I was in college, I went to the card catalog room. that shows it was a while ago. It's before Google, before the internet. You had to go to the card catalog room. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, there was a room the size of a football field with these giant chests of drawers, and you would pull out these really long, 3-foot long drawers that had index cards, little cards, and every book was contained there. There would be a card for the title, a card for the author, and a card for the subject. So I wanted to write about Asian Americans and civil rights, and I looked, and there weren't any such books. Nobody had ever put those concepts together, Asian Americans and civil rights. So I decided, well, I'll check out the books on race. And every single book I picked up, whether it was by a liberal, a conservative, a reactionary, a Marxist, whether it was by a historian or a sociologist or a celebrity or a journalist, whether it was old or new, even if the dust jacket blurb said it had the latest statistics, all the census data, they all used a black and white paradigm. What I mean by that is they assumed that there wasn't anybody else in the world. There was no one who was Latino, or the term used then, Hispanic. There weren't Native Americans, First Peoples, and there certainly weren't Asian immigrants and their American-born progeny. Sometimes at the very beginning of the book, the author would say, well, there are some of these other people, but I don't know anything about them, so they're not in my book. And I would look at this and I would think to myself, well, I'm offended, not as an Asian American, I'm offended as someone who wants to write a good term paper and wants to have data and present evidence, because the picture of the world that's being presented here, I thought, wasn't accurate. All I had to do was stroll across campus, and I could see that there were people who did not fit neatly into one of these two boxes. So I wondered, well, what should we do about that? I then continued to do my research, and if you study race, you come across W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a race man, founder of the NAACP, and before that, the Niagara movement, one of the very first African-American civil rights movements. Du Bois is known for his theory of the talented 10th, that those who had rights had responsibilities. He debated Booker T. Washington, a leader in his own right, who would acquiesce to racial segregation, Jim Crow. Washington's view was cast down your bucket where you are. Black and white could be like the fingers of a hand, separate but equal. Du Bois would have none of that. He demanded equality first and foremost, and not just equality in one sphere, but politically, economically, culturally, socially. And in 1903, he wrote a magisterial work never out of print. It blended memoir and history. It talked about the problem of dual consciousness before that was applied to hyphenated Americans. It talked about what it was like to be a problem, the Negro problem, as it was spoken of then by people who were concerned. And if you've ever studied race, you've come across a sentence, a passage, a line that Du Bois wrote, and he was prescient as well as profound. The quote is this: the problem of the 20th century, remember he was writing in 1903, is the problem of the color line. What's fascinating about this quote is it's taken out of context. No one ever gives you the whole sentence. They only give you the front half. It's not even half. It's not even half the words in the sentence. He continued, dash, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea. Now, what is so important about that? Well, as you learn in law school, those additional words aren't just surplus. You don't just discard them, you don't just throw them away, they help in the interpretation. Here was someone whose commitment to Black equality could not be doubted for a moment. He was a champion of the cause like no other. Yet he situated it in a context. He always thought, and once you see that line, and you look at the novels he wrote, the plays, the newspaper columns, his sociological studies, you look at his travels, he died on the eve of Martin Luther King's March on Washington, D.C. in 1963, having been born during Reconstruction. He lived some 90 plus years, retiring finally to Ghana. You would see when you look at the body of his work that the conceit I had, race in America beyond Black and white, wasn't an original idea of mine. Every undergraduate thinks that they come up with every idea, they're the first to think it. No, it was Du Bois's idea. So it was to his project that I returned the notion that when you add the darker to lighter races of people in Asia and Africa and the Americas and the islands of the sea, you help, not harm, the historic struggle for Black equality. So let's talk a little bit about allyship. That's written out. And I'll give you several examples here, 3. So let's look at the central image. That's Malcolm X, assassinated in New York City. In Life magazine, the pictorial of then the leading photo journalism magazine. Do you see in the main image, there's an Asian American woman cradling the head of the martyred leader. People sometimes have looked at that and wondered, who is that person? Well, that's Yuri Kochiyama. She's just below the Life magazine spread. She was a Japanese-American housewife. Inspired by Malcolm X, she became his closest confidant, colleague, and was at his side, as the photo attests to. On the left, you have Grace Lee Boggs, leaders. They were labor organizers working side by side. Grace Lee Boggs passed away at 100 not too long ago. On the right, you have the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, which marched with Dr. King. There they are with their banner and a contingent that marched alongside blacks and whites in that moment that so many recall under the hot sun, that was even more radical than it is perceived now. So allyship has been around for a long time. It's just been pushed to the margins instead of being recognized as a new mainstream. Indeed, Asian Americans themselves have been around for a long time. They helped realize manifest destiny, uniting the nation from sea to shining sea. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished 151 years ago. Last year was its sesquicentennial. And the Chinese, 10 to 15,000 laborers, men who came on labor contracts that they thought would be much more lucrative, paid less than their white counterparts. They constituted almost the entirety of the Western workforce headed from California eastward. The term Chinaman's chance comes from how backbreaking the work was and dangerous. They were lowered in those wicker baskets bearing the new technology of dynamite to blast through sheer rock wall, as this painting by Jake Lee shows. And they sometimes didn't emerge. They died because of how volatile that explosive was. At Promontory Point, Utah, when the Golden Spike was driven in a ceremony that brought famous celebratory photo, one of the most famous American photos of that century. And if you look, however closely you look, there's an omission. Even though the western half had been built by the Chinese laborers, there's no Chinese face to be seen. They were excluded from the celebrations, as they later would be from the nation. I also have here an image of a book about the native Hawaiians, whose peaceful kingdom was overthrown in the creation of American empire, also typically not discussed. What then happened is the Asian immigrants were driven out. That's the title of a book that documents this, in violent attacks such as mass lynchings at Rock Springs, Wyoming, and other places where there were historic Chinese settlements. Every man, woman, and child was killed or violently driven from their home, including by other immigrants who were white. I have here an image of something, I didn't even know this, because so much of this history that is American history, not just Asian American history, we just never learned. A book called Asians and Pacific Islanders and the Civil War. I have this because when I learned of this, I thought it couldn't possibly be true. And I'm sure many people, including Asian immigrants today, have that feeling. I was describing this to an exchange student from China who said, no, that can't be. Well, this book by the U.S. National Park Service is their official guidebook. They researched it and they looked at the rosters of the Union and Confederate armies, and there were hundreds. We're not talking about one or two. We're not talking about a few dozen. There were hundreds of Asian soldiers in that conflict from 1861 to 1865, if you can imagine. In Texas, even, there's a museum of ethnic groups in San Antonio that you can visit that documents this history. And the Texas Republic had Asian immigrants from before it joined the Union, astonishingly enough. So now turn to a couple of the contemporary images. The first is the model minority. Asian immigrants come here penniless with nothing, but they succeed and become super successful overachievers thanks to an Oriental secret. They beat their children if the report card isn't perfect. The kids are rocket scientists, whiz kids, right? They have a perfect 4.0. They enter college at the age of 11. You know, they learn to play the violin at 3, the piano at 5, and then they're playing at Carnegie Hall by the time they're 7, maybe playing the violin and the piano simultaneously. For a couple caveats before I explain what's wrong with it. The first is, I applaud. I want to be absolutely clear about this. I applaud everyone who is a success. Some people, though, are brain drained. They didn't come quite penniless, or they came with scholarships. But I applaud everyone who has done well for themselves. My concern is when we generalize on a racial basis, because we know how dangerous racial stereotypes are. They get exaggerated and distorted, and I hope to show you, turned on their heads. The other difficulty here is sometimes people say to me, wait a minute, what's wrong with you? How politically correct and thin-skinned and hypersensitive could you be? People are trying to compliment you. They're saying you're good at math and science, you're smart, you're hardworking. Can't you take a compliment? Well, the model minority myth doesn't stand on its own. Think about some other compliments. If someone says about someone Jewish, oh, they're good at making money. Well, we know to pause for a moment because there's such an anti-Semitic tradition to statements such as that. If someone says of African-American athletes, oh, they're natural athletes, we also want to listen carefully because sometimes the next statement is, well, they were bred that way, right? It's more brawn than brains. They can be the running back, but not the quarterback, right? It takes away the individual effort and achievement. It suggests brutality. Or when someone says to someone who's African-American, my, you're so articulate. Well, yes, that's a compliment, but it's also as if to say, you don't sound the way I expected. I was thinking you would sound different. You sound better than your cousins, than the stereotype that I have. So this image comes from a story in the New York Times Sunday magazine that was published 2 generations ago called Success Story, Japanese American Style. And it praised Japanese Americans for everything they had done. There was an early article about Chinese Americans in US News and World Report. There's a catch though, and I'll explain what that is. So why can't you accept a compliment? Well, you know, this compliment was also at the basis of yellow peril, the idea that Asians were too hardworking, that they were intent on taking over the world, that they had to be stopped. So let's take a look at this compliment. Well, let's talk about the facts first. So the oddity, the irony is Asian Americans also display rising income inequality and high poverty rates. So you'll see this is the Pew Research folks. Asians displace blacks as the most economically divided group in the United States. So you might think to yourself, well, how can this be? Well, it's because Asian American groups together different ethnicities. So there are people who are Southeast Asian, who are refugees, for example, who in socioeconomic status look very similar to African Americans. Even within a single group, so consider Chinese Americans, it's a bimodal distribution, if you want to be very technical. What does that mean? Well, it's not a bell curve, it has 2 peaks. You have those folks who are coming, who are investors, who are buying the penthouse apartments in cash, who are the new upper middle class in Asia. And then you have those who are undocumented, who we don't talk about, who work at the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. And these are distant cousins, literally and figuratively, but they occupy different parts of the socioeconomic range. So the problem with the model minority myth is it's just not factually accurate. But there are three bigger issues. The first is whitewashing bias. So Asian Americans are actually the least likely group in America to be promoted to management in Silicon Valley, where you would think they're highly regarded. They face bullying and hazing at high levels. But when you try to complain, the response is, oh, come on, we know Asians you're all rich anyway. Right? It's all crazy rich Asians. So that's the first problem, that when Asian Americans say, wait a minute, we're facing issues, people doubt it, even if you have statistical proof. The second problem is racial resentment. The late historian Ronald Takaki said Asian immigrants historically have been punished for their virtues rather than their vices. What do I mean by that? Well, during the exclusion era, and I put an image up because it sounds so preposterous, on the left, there is a pamphlet. This is, again, before the internet, before television, before radio, when people printed pamphlets. It was put together by the Asiatic Exclusion League of San Francisco. This is by Samuel Gompers, the AFL. This is a progressive labor leader, and he writes a book called Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Cooleyism, which shall survive. This is an extended argument for, and you have to read it to believe it. Don't believe me, Google it, look at it for yourself. His argument is, white people need to eat meat, Asian people subsist on rice, that's unfair, Asians work harder, we have to throw them out. So let me be clear. You would think it's a compliment, you work hard, but no, that's the argument for why Asians can't be allowed in, because they're too hardworking. The book Musicians from a Different Shore documents what happens when Asians and Asian Americans are successful as musicians, as that child prodigy. You know what the critics say? They say, technically perfect, but no character, no soul, right? So this is how, even if you're really good, even if you're perfect, it's held against you. And so there's a concern, how come the Asians are taking over? So a few years back at UCLA, there was a video that a white student put up just openly saying she just couldn't take being around all these Asians. There are just too many Asians, right? And how come the Asians are invading? So racial resentment is stirred up. But I left the worst problem for last. It's false flattery. It's not about Asian Americans at all. It's a none too subtle way of saying to African Americans, look at the Asians. They made it. Why can't you? When you go back to that story that I showed you at the very beginning, New York Times story, same thing is true of the US News story. The front half is all about, oh, Asian Americans, they're great. And then the author of the New York Times piece expressly says that example could be compared to what he called, his words, not mine, problem minorities. And you didn't need him to wink at you to know who those were, because he then goes on point by point to compare Asian Americans to Negroes and Mexicans. So there's a way of preferring Asian Americans, this article on the left, at least you're not black, right? It's this idea that Asian Americans are the good immigrants, the good minority, and that's the worst part, that Asian Americans are being brought into the picture, not to unite, but to divide. So it leads to inaccurate comparisons that appear in best-selling books. The second image I want to take a moment to talk about is the perpetual foreigner syndrome. Asian Americans know this well. It's, where are you really from? There's nothing wrong with asking someone where they're from. That's what you ask when you meet a stranger. We're not doing much of that these days, but I'm one of those folks who always talks to the taxi cab driver, the person on the airplane seated next to me, and you ask where you're from. It's a way to situate someone, literally and figuratively, right? We ask that when we meet new colleagues, but Asian Americans and some others are asked, where are you really from? Which is selective. We don't ask everyone that. And it's as if to say, now my parents would say they're from China because they are. But I say I'm from Detroit because I really am. But when you say, where are you really from? You're saying, I can't determine my own destiny. I'm not who I say I am. I'm a liar. I'm an imposter. And when I answer, sometimes people say, oh, yes, I thought so. Right? They've placed me in their geography of race. They can sleep easy at night. So some of the earliest arguments that were made about the Asians coming here were that they were sojourners, that they didn't intend to stay, and that explained the bias. which gets the cause and effect all wrong. It's not that they didn't intend to stay and face bias, it's that they faced bias and chose to leave. By the way, white immigrants left at enormous rates. The book Round Trip to America documents how a century ago, so many of the people who came as peasants from European nations became modestly well off here, but were able after 40 years to retire to the old country. And when they went back to the province from whence they had come, because they had saved, because they'd been frugal, and sometimes they had kept their family back there, they were able to live so much better. So a return migration, as it's called, is common among all groups. But the best example for Asian Americans of how this isn't just people insulting you, but it leads to policy decisions that uproot thousands of people is the internment. During World War II, 120,000 individuals, 2/3 United States citizens, men, women, children, the elderly, the disabled, even United States military veterans. So you see in this photo, a veteran of what was called the Great War of Japanese descent being taken away. He wears his military uniform because he wants it known that he had risked his life to fight overseas in Europe for the United States only a generation earlier before being accused of disloyalty. With no charges brought against them in masse, unlike German Americans and Italian Americans who were incarcerated on an individual basis, these people were put into hastily built internment camps in desolate areas. That's the consequence of the perpetual foreigner syndrome. And it wasn't just because of Pearl Harbor, as this image shows. It was anti-Asian sentiment from well before. And Dr. Seuss, the beloved children's book author, was someone who helped to promote it with the idea that in the cartoon that he drew, that Japanese Americans would be helping Japan as the fifth column, a term used for the traitors within. It's also what motivated the Vincent Chin murder. There's much more to this than we have time for today. I wouldn't do it justice. I'll just say, in 1982 in Detroit, my hometown, this is what changed my life. I didn't know Chin, but when I read about this, I knew he could be my cousin, my brother, or even me. A Chinese American was brutally bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat by two whites, a father and stepson, auto workers, one of them out of work, who used those terms that I remember so well in the common cruelty of the playground, chink and jap and gook. Witnesses said they'd heard chink and jap, and nip, a term you don't even hear anymore. And then one of the men shouted, "It's because of," pardon the language, this is what witnesses reported, "it's because of you little motherfuckers," they said, "that we're out of work," meaning that this was mistaken identity twice over. Never mind that Chin was Chinese, not Japanese. Never mind that he was an American, not a foreigner, that he was working class, no different than his attackers. They blamed him for the success of imported cars, of Toyota and Tokyo. He represented the land of the rising sun, right? And the two killers never for a moment, never denied that they committed the act. For those of you who are law students, you know, I just said, well, it wasn't bigotry. It was just a bar brawl, not a hate crime. They were sentenced to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000 each. This attack occurred just before Chin was due to be married. He was celebrating his bachelor's party. The guests who would have attended his wedding went to his funeral instead. So these notions aren't just hurt feelings. They turn into brutal violence and fatal attacks. Despite the sacrifice of life and limb, Asian Americans are doubted. We have here so many photos. If you take a look in the lower right, that's President John F. Kennedy talking to a young Senator, Daniel Inouye. If you look carefully at the photo, you'll see something odd about the right sleeve of his suit. It's hanging awkwardly because he lost his arm charging a Nazi bunker during World War II as part of the famed 442nd, the most highly decorated United States military unit in history, the segregated Japanese American unit, that and the 100th Regimental Combat Team. The image of the woman on the left is Senator Tammy Duckworth, who lost both of her legs when her helicopter crashed. She's ancestors fought with George Washington. You might wonder how that could be. She's Anglo-Asian. Her mother was a Thai Chinese migrant, and her father is 13 generations of military service in that family. So she belongs to the Daughters of the American Revolution. So nonetheless, when she was running for office, she was mocked by her rival for her military service, who said, "Oh, I didn't know that Thai helped George Washington." These wrongs have been acknowledged. You'll see Senator Inouye again there, just behind President Ronald Reagan, when the 1988 Civil Liberties Act was passed that paid reparations to those who had been in the internment camps. I want to take a moment to acknowledge how diverse the Asian American community is. Charles Mingus, jazz great, was Afro-Asian, as are so many. You likely know Keanu Reeves is Asian, as is Tiger Woods. The woman there being lifted in the chair is celebrating her bat mitzvah. She's Jewish. She's a Chinese adoptee of two Jewish parents. There also are, of course, new migrants who are coming with politically very different views. This has led people to talk about the changing face of America that we're seeing, we already are, becoming white minority, the end of white Christian America, and Asian Americans are very much a part of that, the fastest growing racial or ethnic group. So here are a few images of Afro-Asians and Asian Latinx. The photo of the Japanese migrant there is being held by his granddaughter, who set out on a quest to continue the work of her father, who never learned what happened to his father because he was taken away the day after Pearl Harbor. In the middle, you have a photo that shows you, it's a book cover, the Mexican Punjabi community of California due to intermarriage when anti-miscegenation laws were still on the books. Okay, we're just about done. So Asian Americans have always been ambiguous and perhaps ambivalent themselves. I believe we face a moral dilemma for individuals and communities as Asian Americans are being blamed for COVID-19. Not just for being contagious, but for being culpable. Not just the notion that they are vectors for infection, but that somehow as a people they are to blame, or being thought of as spies, as if every person of Chinese descent who comes here is a sleeper agent waiting to rise up. They've written an open letter to their families, even before to talk about why Black Lives Matter and their support. So you see in Texas, in particular, one of these cases where a family of people of Burmese background, but US citizens, was stabbed by someone who blamed them for coronavirus. And the number of Blacks and Asian Americans who say they've experienced discrimination outpaces the general population. Yet there's an abiding belief in the American dream. Asian immigrants continue to come and hope to share in the prosperity of this nation through the opportunity available here. They seek to make their future on these shores. So with that, I'll say that diversity and democracy are twin ideals, both processes, not outcomes. They require our engagement, our participation. That is ultimately what our society has been built upon. This experiment in self-governance, unlike any other in the annals of human history, will remain, and I hope we always will be, that shining city upon a hill, an exemplar the world over that beckons for so many of us who know that opportunities, it is up to us to make good on these ideals. Thank you so much. That is the PowerPoint. I'm happy to take questions, and I believe Dean Baines is going to come back. Here he is.
I'm back. That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So while we're waiting for questions, I have some thoughts and questions for you about that. It was a really wonderful, great overview of the topic. And so one thing that struck me is your discussion of Du Bois and how so often things get truncated to one little line of, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, but meaning people don't look at the full text and show, as you indicated, that it covers the islands, Asia, and other places. It reminds me of Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, where it was known for, the colorblind jurisprudence. And I remember our mutual friend, and I think he may be on the call, Jack Chin, did research on this. And he showed that in most leading case books, constitutional law case books, it omitted the fact that in one breath, Justice Harlan was talking about colorblind constitutionalism, but in the other breath, he basically castigated people of Chinese ancestry. And it was missing from almost every casebook. I don't know, haven't followed Jack's work on this recently, but it was really fascinating. So we're left with this picture of someone who's like, very progressive, thoughtful, ahead of his time, but he's still making choices between different racial minority groups and treating them very, very differently. So what are your thoughts on that?
I do want to credit, whether he's on the Zoom or not, our mutual friend, Jack Chin, a law professor, who did the sort of rigorous scholarship that deserves to be lifted up and acknowledged. But what he did was he took something that had been sitting out in the open, but that everyone else had overlooked. No one had pointed this out. So not only had they not pointed out, they had deliberately edited it away to create this image of the great dissenter. So let me offer a bit of background. For those of you who are studying law, you will certainly look in con law at this famous 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay? It's the case that ushered in de jure, meaning by law, segregation. 8-1, the justices said that there was no problem with a mandate enforced by the state that railroad cars had to have white compartments and black compartments. It was opposed by Homer Plessy, who was in the language of the time, not a word I would use now, an octoroon, meaning of his 8 great-grandparents, 7 were white, 1 was black. But under the racist one-drop rule, the idea that the single bit of black ancestry would taint the purity of white blood, he was deemed black. He went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he lost. Plessy dissented, and so everyone says, I'm sorry, not Plessy, Harlan. Harlan dissented, yeah. So everyone said, Harlan is just great. He dissented, he stood up for Homer Plessy, and he penned the famous phrase, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Sounds great, doesn't it? Let me read you the rest of the passage because you can't just stop there. He says, in respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before law. Again, sounds great. All right. You can look this up for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Verify it. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, he said. These are his words. He continues, and so it is in prestige, achievements, education, wealth, and power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty. But in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there's in the country, no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. What does he mean? This is, there are various colloquial ways you could describe this passage. I'll just say it appears to be contradictory, but it's not. One of the things that non-lawyers really dislike about lawyers is sometimes we say things that they turn out to be the opposite of what most people would think we're saying. That's what Justice Harlan is doing. He's saying the law formally, in its abstract way, is colorblind, and that will promote and reinforce and ensure that the white race remains the dominant race, right? So color blindness, this isn't my interpretation, these are Harlan's own words, is in the service of white supremacy. So when you talk about color blindness, you have to distinguish between what Martin Luther King spoke of so eloquently when he was actually talking about as a moral precept, and what Harlan was talking about, which is just as a formal legal concept. There's another passage though, and this is what our friend Jack Chin pointed out, which is Harlan again and again and again votes against the Chinese who litigate all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they did far more than people have any sense, establishing, for example, birthright citizenship, which benefits everyone and unites African Americans, for whom the 14th Amendment was passed primarily, the Latinx community, because now when birthright citizenship is challenged, it's mainly by people who are concerned about an influx from across the southern border, ignoring the many people undocumented of all backgrounds, right? But Harlan wrote in the same case, all right, in Plessy v. Ferguson, what Jack pointed out was every major casebook he looked at took out this passage. Here's Harlan. There is a race so different from our own, meaning whites, that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. Persons belonging to it are, with few exceptions, absolutely excluded from our country. I allude to the Chinese race. But by the statute in question, a Chinaman can ride in the same passenger coach with white citizens of the United States. What is he saying here? He's saying he doesn't like Jim Crow racial segregation because it allows the Chinaman to sit with white. So his view is, well, I mean, heck, if you're going to let the Chinaman into the railroad car, you may as well let African Americans. So it's always important. So there's a takeaway here that's got nothing to do with the race, but for the law students, don't read things out of context. You've got to see, where did that line come from? Because when you keep reading, you find out it means the opposite of what you thought it meant, and people can abuse it and fool you by manipulating words in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Hey, thank you. Second question for you. I have a couple from the audience, but I want to have the pleasure to have a dialogue with you. So the second thing is, you talk about the model minority myth and that, and how, and it's really, your points are well taken, but how does it affect students or individuals individually or emotionally? I mean, if you're told that, you know, oh, you're supposed to be perfect, or you're supposed to be a math whiz, or you're supposed to have, you know, graduate summa cum laude with all these honors and all this stuff. What happens? Not every Asian American person graduates or does all of those things. They're widely, you know, they have a wide distribution of grades and all sorts of merit as anybody else. So what happens to those, or what would you counsel those who don't meet that myth? I mean, I imagine it must be an emotional cost to them from society or families and other places.
Yeah, there are suicides. There are crazy cases of people who tell their parents and everyone they know that they're going to go to such and such elite institution of higher education. They forge a letter of acceptance, they move away, and they didn't get in. But they can't tell anyone. Now, they got into perfectly fine institutions, but because they're expected to always be the overachiever, you can't be normal. You also can't be an athlete, an artist, a rebel. You can't be yourself. You have to conform to a stereotype, right? And that places this enormous pressure on people who are just ordinary, decent people who just want to live their lives, but they're expected to be math whizzes. Well, you know, not everyone is a math whiz, and that's okay, right? We shouldn't subject people to that type of pressure, while also understanding different cultural norms that for so many Asian American kids, I'm one of them, you grow up thinking, gee, my parents, they just hate me because other parents say to their kids, oh, I love you. Other parents hug one another. Other parents display emotion. My parents, you know, appeared to, they lived up to the stereotype or down to it, display no emotion and care not one bit. And their form of encouragement was to tell me, you need to try harder, right? when I became an adult, I realized, okay, they're expressing themselves in a very culturally different way. Um, and they're not demonstrative to one another about being affectionate the way that my white friends, that their parents were. And that's okay. But my hope is to create a space for the kids who are trying to adapt and adjust. And I see this again and again in so many communities. The people, for example, who they don't want to be in an arranged marriage. That's one of the ways this really comes up. And they just need to say to their parents, while respecting that their immigrant parents were in an arranged marriage, that it's not for them. Okay. I've been tempted to write an essay, and I say this with the utmost respect for my parents. They sacrifice so much. You know, I'm pretty hardworking, but compared to my parents, I'm a total slacker, right? So I say this with the utmost respect. But I actually have written a blog entitled "Everything My Asian Immigrant Parents Taught Me Turns Out to Be Wrong." I'll take a moment to explain that. Again, this is with respect, the title is in jest. Every Asian culture has a proverb. The Japanese version is the best known. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. Right? What's that about? That's about being quiet, polite, not making a fuss. It's about fidelity to tradition, deference to one's elders, being submissive, right? It's about knowing your place. There's a phrase in Chinese, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter, right? Same concept. Or if you're Mandarin speaking, there's actually a phrase, I know just a smattering of Mandarin, 不要找麻烦. All right, that translates quite literally as don't go looking for trouble, right? Compare the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So I found out, I realized when I went to work at a law firm, gee, if I'm the polite, quiet Asian who's good at math and science, who just puts my head down and works harder, the way my parents taught me, I'm not going to last 2 weeks, right? People will just walk all over me. And you know, you can't be bowing and shuffling and backing out of the room in a culture that doesn't understand that, right? That doesn't understand ritual apology, that doesn't have the same norms, because I'll give you a very simple example. A lot of Asian cultures, not just Asian cultures, a lot of cultures where you don't make direct eye contact. You kind of look down, you know, you don't, because it's challenging. You're not supposed to do, with your superiors, you're not supposed to look right at them that way, right? But if you don't do that in America, people think the person's shifty, not reliable. What are they trying to hide? What's wrong with them? Why can't they look at me, right? So you learn to adjust, and you have to code switch, right? If you grow up in a household where people don't slap one another on the back, right? But you want to make partner at the law firm, you want to fit in, and you can't be awkward if you're going to slap someone on the back or do something like that, right? You have to learn what fork to pick up. You know, if you're invited to the country club, right? When I was a kid, I didn't even know what a country club was, right? Or a private club. My family certainly wasn't going any place like that. I had relatives who worked in service, right? Who would have been familiar, but as the staff, not as the members of places like that. Back to you, Dean. And I'm mindful of time. The audience has been great, and I want to thank all of you.
No, they've been great.
Given me a very
one last question, and then I'll move to the audience, if that's okay. So the thing that struck me also is about the perpetual foreigner, and for African Americans, I think the post-Civil War era or before pre-Civil War era, where there was this whole contention of whether we should send out people of African descent back to Africa, send them to Haiti or some of the Caribbean. It seemed as though that was sort of very much related or very similar, and then all of a sudden it seemed as though we're just stuck with them. But then you see with birtherism and sort of the recent incident with the 4 women of color, one who was Ayanna Pressley, who's clearly African American, been here for generations, with the chant "Go back to wherever you came from." It seems as though that's right, raising its head with respect to the African American community or people of African descent community, as it has with other groups. And what's your take on that?
Yeah, so there's similarities and commonalities, and there are differences. I recognize even when we talk about diversity, there's diversity within diversity. When we talk about newcomers to this nation, that narrative isn't compelling for some people whose ancestors came in bondage, right? Who have been on this land since before the land was appropriated, right? They're African Americans who are part of the Great Migration from the Deep South to the North or to places such as Texas. And so I try to be sensitive that there are stories that connect, that are related, but they're also distinct. And you're right, for the Black diaspora, it's so complicated. People don't realize Abraham Lincoln, who I think the judgment of history continues to exalt, and rightly so, but he actually was a proponent of the colonization movement. He actually, and more than once, and he invited leaders of this movement to the White House, he believed actually that Blacks and whites could not coexist in the nation, and the best resolution was to somehow peacefully move everyone who was Black out of the United States back to Africa, even if there were multiple generations from there. And then, of course, Marcus Garvey and other Black nationalists actually embraced a concept, involving Liberia and so on. So this is complicated, and there isn't a single way to resolve this. Otherwise, we would have. And as so many have testified to so eloquently, so much of the Black population is of mixed ancestry, and thanks to genetic testing, we can find out that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had multiple, and they're descendants of so many of the prominent figures whose statues are being toppled, who are themselves African-American descendants. They're the descendants typically from violent encounters with Black women who were the property of the white men who fathered children with them. A story that is only now being told and so complicated and fraught and impossible for me to do justice to, but that needs to be told. So absolutely, you're right. There are complications upon complications because I recognize, and I'm always trying to think about how do we build bridges? You always have a choice here, right? Do we increase the tension and the anger, or do we decrease the tension and the anger? And some just want to keep ratcheting it up, right, for ulterior motives until we all hate one another. You can't have a conversation. You can't chit chat with a stranger on the street because you are just too anxious about what that means, and everyone feels this. But there are so many differences. I'll give you an example of something that I learned at Howard. That's a difficult issue beyond the scope of what we can talk about, but I just want to raise it. When you look at the Black diaspora, you have African Americans and you have people who are newly arrived. They're Jamaican, and they don't quite identify in the way that native-born African Americans do. They're Afro-Canadian, they're Black Britons, they're Nigerian, they're Haitian, and they want it known. They actually have claimed an identity. They're Nigerian Americans, right? They're first or second generation. I want to be respectful of that. And so sometimes you find tension, right? When I taught at Howard, I taught people who were the fourth generation to go to Howard, right? Their great-grandparents had been doctors or lawyers when that was just about unheard of, right? I also taught people who were too poor to be able to buy books, right? I say that in a sympathetic way. They lack resources, they have the talent, but and people who were Buddhists, who were Jewish, who were high church Episcopalians, who were Baptists, who were Muslims. So there's this huge diversity that, for the most part, just as Asian American is this catch-all that encompasses so many nationalities that fought total wars against one another just 3 generations ago, so too all of these constructions that we try to put people in, they're placeholders, they're generic and general, and they suffer all the flaws that every shortcut does when we try not to look at individual cases, but just to aggregate and take the average. I think we have time for
Let's do some questions. So how should we respond to contention that affirmative action adversely affects Asian Americans. APAs could do better without.
This, yeah, yeah. This is it's a whole hour. I'll just be very brief so we can take another question. I want to be thoughtful. I know there are differing opinions. I'm going to give you three very quick answers. The first is we tend to confuse a couple issues. Right? I'm absolutely on the side of Asian immigrants, Asian Americans who want a fair shot, a fair shake. They don't want to be discriminated against. They want to be judged by the color of their skin. I don't doubt that there's anti-Asian bias. All right, but here's my first point. Anti-Asian bias, people discriminating against Asian Americans, is not the same and is not caused by people trying to help African Americans, people who are Latinx. Those are two different issues that have gotten confused, or to use a fancy term, conflated, right? So when Asian Americans get mad, it's a total non sequitur. Here's what usually happens. Asian Americans are all agitated, as they should be. And they go to a school and they say, you're placing quotas on us, ceilings. And people there say, oh, we have to do that because we have to help blacks. That doesn't follow at all, right? It's a way to shift the blame. So that's my first response. My second response is, of all the positions you can possibly take, okay, and I know Asian Americans have many different views, right? And that's fine. Here's one that doesn't work. It's both unprincipled and not practical because other people aren't naive and stupid. You can't say, I oppose affirmative action in higher education, but I want to see it at the workplace. I oppose it everywhere where I think I personally won't benefit at all, but I want to see it where I think I'm going to be included. Why? Because everyone's going to say, well, why would I be your ally? Why would I help you? Why would I march for you? You're just, it is a sort of raw, naked self-interest that you're just unabashedly saying, I just want what's in it for me. Give me these programs here, but not there. The third response I'll give is Asian Americans have benefited from, that's the great irony. So many Asian Americans have historically and today benefit from affirmative action. For example, I'll give you two very quick examples. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, actually our friend Jack Chin has written about this as well. And I think it's good that scholars share ideas, and it's also important to acknowledge that. So I want to model that for your students. 1964 Immigration and Nationality Act removed the last vestiges of open nationality-based discrimination from about a century ago. So we used to have a National Origins Act. It excluded the Asians, created an Asiatic Barred Zone, and as to white ethnics, allotted only quotas that were openly meant to preserve ethnic balance within the United States. They, for some reason, didn't think that people would meet other people of different backgrounds and intermarry. I will put that to one side. 1965, that gets all removed with a much more egalitarian system. That wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was passed the year before, because they were both part of John F. Kennedy's vision. So Kennedy gets assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president, a Texan, who is a masterful politician, probably the last best great politician in the good sense and the bad sense. He was by no means perfect. He had plenty of blemishes, but he was a deal maker. In part supported by the Kennedy brothers and by the nation's mourning for its martyred leader, he got both the 64 Civil Rights Act passed, to which people said, you know, you've just cost the Democrats the South forever, and he was willing to live with that. And then he got the 64 Immigration and Nationality Act passed. Most Asian Americans today are foreign born. That is, they came from elsewhere. They would not have been allowed in if it weren't for the 1965 Civil Rights Act. So they directly benefited, and if they didn't, their parents did. They wouldn't be Asian Americans if it weren't for that act that was passed. That act wouldn't have passed if it weren't for the Civil Rights Act the year before. It's all of a piece. You look at the Harvard case, you look at the Yale case that's just been filed. One of the most touching and wonderful things to see is allyship at work. The Asian American students who have stood up and said, you know, I'm here because holistic review was used to review me. Because, you know, people tend to think, oh, it must be a quota, it's just race. It isn't that. What's being challenged here is the idea that we all have something to bring to the table that's not just a grade or a test score, and that we have to look at the entire package. And separate from that, what's really going on is forced competition for scarce resources, that it's an artificial zero-sum game, most people who are angry about affirmative action, you know what they're actually angry about? And I want to be rational and calm, or try to be, and it'll just stir them up. But they're angry because there aren't enough seats, there aren't enough of this resource to go around. At the most elite colleges, the admission rate is about 5% or lower. Everyone who got in, you could kick them all out and a brand new class, and you wouldn't alter the metrics at all. And almost everyone who didn't get in, if you got rid of affirmative action, if you just lined people up by test score, all of them, almost all of them, still wouldn't get in. So that drives this anger. You want to point at somebody and blame them. So Asian Americans are told, point at the Black people, the Latinx people. You didn't get in because that person got in ahead of you. That's not why you didn't get in. You didn't get in because of anti-Asian bias. So that wasn't a lengthy answer, but it was a fact-based one. And Dean Baines, you could have me back some other time, and I'll unpack.
There are quite a lot of questions about affirmative action. I think that you may have handled most of them. I mean, I guess the thing is that what I would say, one of the questions asked, well, there's a lot of, you were saying a lot, the question asked about the media stereotype and the media, and how do you deal with that with respect to the discourse with respect to affirmative action. So why don't we take that? But you discussed Bloom, you discussed the Harvard case, you discussed a lot of things that a lot of people asked about.
Yeah, what's happened is, look, I spent my entire life saying Asian Americans should stand up and speak out. Asian Americans need to be included. I'm crushed at the idea that Asian Americans will stand up and speak out in order to denigrate African Americans and other people of color. Good that they're participating, not so good that the way that they're participating is to attack others, and that they're being brought into the picture as spoilers, as racial spoilers. You know, I want to acknowledge something. No community is perfect. We're all human beings. And there are so many divisions within divisions. And for me, the constant challenge is, how do we overcome this? I'll tell you something. I've been in a room before, more than once, where it's just Asian Americans. And someone who's Asian American will say, you know, it really is true. We're smarter and we work harder. We're going to take over, right? You shouldn't believe that. And even if you believe that, you should not run around saying that, because you're going to get beaten up. Then I'm going to get beaten up because other people are going to say, you see, it's the yellow peril. They really do believe it. But then I've been in a room where it's just people of Chinese descent. And they say things about the Indians. They say things about the Japanese, the Koreans, and on and on and on. So it turns out they're not really into being Asian American. Right? I'm just talking about one or two people. Right? But you can all picture who I'm thinking of, right? You have a cousin like that, right? It's the cousin or uncle. They have one beer too many at Thanksgiving, and then you don't want to talk to them anymore. Or your grandmother's going to have to step in and, you know, say, you know, stop talking about this stuff. But I've also been in a room of just Chinese who speak Mandarin, and they disparage the Chinese who speak Cantonese, or those who speak Cantonese disparage the ones who speak Mandarin. The ones from Shanghai look down on the ones from someplace else. Don't even get me started about Taiwan or Hong Kong and, you know, Houston. This is just a descriptive statement, not making anything. And if you look into that, you'll realize like just one community. But once you get in that community, you realize, wow, this is never ending, this work to try to bring people together, because every time you get people together, somebody will want to disrupt it, not in a positive way to make progress, but in a regressive way that takes us back to sort of primal brute instincts about my tribe, right? When people talk about my people and your people, you know, I think to myself, well, my people are not defined by ethnicity. They're sort of reasonable people who believe in rule of law and evidence and logic. That's my people, right? It's not defined by color of skin. It's defined by, do you want to engage in rational behavior and welcome others who also want to engage in rational behavior and peaceful coexistence and collaboration and work on coming up with a vaccine for coronavirus, right? Without making it political or nationalized in a way that likely does not, on the whole, advance humanity. Dean Baines, I think we're probably out of time.
One last question.
All right.
Just one last question. Have you seen or do you expect an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans based on the coronavirus? So you just mentioned as a follow-up.
We already have. It's already happened. I showed you the Texas case. There are dozens, indeed hundreds of cases. It's everything from the go back to where you came from, to being spit upon, to being shoved, to being stabbed. And the irony is, Asian Americans are grossly overrepresented in healthcare. If you look at the doctors and nurses, whether they're Chinese, Korean, Indian, whether they're Filipino nurses, there are so many. If you look relative to the proportion of the general population, and if you look at the stereotype, what are Asian Americans? Well, they're not lawyers, they're doctors, right? They really are doctors at a higher rate. So they're the very people treating folks for COVID. And this is another one of these examples where it doesn't matter, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, they all look the same. It doesn't matter if you're an American, if you've never been to Wuhan, right? If you've never even heard of Wuhan because you're a fifth generation Texan, right? If you're an adoptee, people still look at you, they see the color of skin, the texture of hair, the shape of eyes, and you did it to us. Your people did this to our people, right? So it's again this line drawing, who's on which side, and that's the constant struggle. How do we break this down and draw the lines differently? So the lines are drawn on the side of being rational and decent human beings versus being human beings who would stab or shoot at peaceful protesters. That's a legitimate line to draw, right? At the line where you say, look, you things, but when you go out and perpetrate violence on people because of their identity, that means you are no longer entitled to be a member of the body politic, right? But for those of us who believe in the ideals of this nation, I'll end on a positive note. I have confidence, I have faith. This is about, and I know this is tough. We're all sheltering in place. Everyone's frustrated. You wake up and you're with the same loved ones that you've been with for 6 months, and you think to yourself, gee, maybe I don't love these people as much as I thought I did. I need a break. I need to get out, right? So we're all feeling this, right? So this time is just so tense, and we always have a choice, right? Will it bring out the best in us or the worst in us? And my gut feeling is for almost all of us, when the moment comes, we rise to that occasion, and it's our better half that shows up. And how do we nudge everyone toward that? That's the challenge for those of us in leadership roles, for those of us who are lawyers or law students being trained on these issues. So again, thank you so much to Dean Baines, to all the co-sponsors, to the wonderful audience, well over 200 people. I am deeply humbled to have been invited to present at the University of Houston Law School. Thank you so much.
And we're really thankful to have you, President Wu. So you're always welcome here in our house. So this concludes our remarks and President Wu's remarks for today and our program. Again, many thanks to our University of Houston Law Center Diversity Committee, our University of Houston Asian American Law School Students Association, the Asian American Bar Association of Greater Houston, and the Houston Bar Association and Houston Young Lawyers Association. Many, many thanks. I know we're going to put up the PowerPoint with the information for the CLE. We'll see whether that will happen soon, but I want to bid you all good night, and again, thank President Wu for his remarks today. So my team, can you put up that PowerPoint so people can get the information they need to qualify for the 1.5 credits of CLE? Thank you so much.